Jon Snow stood in the courtyard of Castle Black, the biting winds of the far north whipping around him. Ghost padded at his side, silent but vigilant, red eyes watching Jon's every move. The news from King's Landing had arrived in a single letter, a blood-stained scrap of parchment brought by a sworn brother of the Night's Watch. Its contents had changed everything. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North, and the man Jon had believed to be his father, was dead. Executed on the steps of the Great September of Baelor by order of King Joffrey Baratheon. The final shred of that letter contained but one line, penned by an unknown hand. The North remembers. Jon's pain was overwhelming. It hollowed him from within, a new kind of cold settling in his chest. Initially, the ancient vows of the Night's Watch chained him here, to these battlements of ice and stone, reminding him that he was meant to have no part in the wars and feuds of the Seven Kingdoms. But if the realm had taught Jon anything, it was that promises could be broken under the weight of necessity and heartbreak. News spread quickly that Robb Stark was raising his banners. The lords of the North had declared for Robb, naming him king in the North. But no raven from Robb had come for Jon. No word of gratitude, no summons, no appeal for his sword. Jon knew it was likely because of the sacred oath he had taken to defend the wall. But that oath felt meaningless now. The Lannisters had killed the man he had believed to be his father. The boy who sat upon the Iron Throne was nothing more than a product of incest, a monster in a child's body, wielding power he did not deserve. The blood in Jon's veins burned with an anger so fierce it threatened to melt the ice beneath his feet. His mind turned treacherous. Why should he remain on the wall, locked in cold duty, while the world burned with injustice? Each night, sleep eluded him, replaced by visions of Ned's final moments. He had dreamt of a raised sword, a crowd screaming, Sansa crying out, and then the blade falling. Dawn arrived each day with no solace. His rage, once banked like a smoldering coal, flared. He wanted to act, but he was bound by tradition and oath. It was in one such brooding moment, standing on the windswept ramparts of Castle Black, that he heard the faint steps of Maester Aemon behind him. Softly, Aemon asked, "You are troubled." Jon didn't turn. "You know why?" The old man gazed out into the swirling snows of the Frostfangs. "I heard you tried to ride south last night." Jon bowed his head, remembering how Ghost had snarled at his side when his sworn brothers intercepted him. But he had not drawn Longclaw. He had no quarrel with his brothers, and they were only following the same vow he had once cherished. He had simply returned, a storm of emotions brewing within him. Maester Aemon laid a frail hand on Jon's shoulder. "You must listen to the truth that sings in your blood, Jon." His voice was whispery, as though a sudden gust might blow it away. "For so long, I have kept silent, but the time for silence has passed. The realm stands on the brink of chaos, and you stand at a crossroads." Jon turned to see unshed tears in Maester Aemon's milky eyes. The old man's grief, so profound, reminded Jon of the losses he himself had borne. The Maester seemed to brace himself before speaking, and what he said next changed Jon's world forever. "Your father was no mere northern lord," Aemon said, voice low, measured. "You carry royal blood, Targaryen blood." Jon froze, a chill deeper than any northern wind washing over him. He felt as though the very foundation of Castle Black trembled beneath him. Could not be true. Rhaegar Targaryen had died decades ago on the Trident, or so the song said. Jon was Ned Stark's bastard, a hidden shame of House Stark, nothing more. But the Maester's expression, filled with heartbreak, conviction, and some lingering hope, spoke volumes. "You are Aegon Targaryen, the true son of Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark," the old man continued, voice growing stronger, as if an otherworldly power guided him. "I have had a vision from the Lord of Light or the old gods. Who can say what power grants such visions? I saw you crowned in fire and ice. I saw black wings spread behind you in the gloom, and I heard the cries of beasts long gone from this world." He closed his eyes, as though the memory itself was too bright to behold. "The truth is this. I once believed all my kin were gone, Now I see I was wrong." Jon looked away, the weight of the maester's words sinking in like fangs. Could it be true? That Ned Stark was not truly his father, but his uncle? The man he had adored, who taught him honor and duty, might have kept the secret of Jon's parentage to protect him from Robert Baratheon's wrath. And Lyanna Stark, Ned's beloved sister, had indeed been linked to Rhaegar Targaryen. The puzzle pieces shifted into place, but the revelation felt too immense, too life-altering. He wanted to shout, to weep, to deny it all. Yet something inside him, some intangible piece of his soul, felt oddly at peace with the knowledge. It was as though an unspoken question he had carried his entire life was finally answered. "Your birth name is Aegon Targaryen," the maester repeated. "Ned was an honorable man. He sheltered you from the enemies that would have wanted you dead from the day you drew your first breath." Jon's pulse hammered in his ears. The truth of his lineage roared through his mind, making him both terrified and exultant. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice rasping. "Am I to go to Dragonstone, to reclaim the Iron Throne from the Lannisters? Or do I remain here, a man of the Night's Watch?" Maester Aemon closed his eyes again. "The vision showed me you must break your oath for a higher calling. Times are dire, Aegon, Jon. Your presence is needed in the South. You will have decisions to make, decisions that will shape the fate of the realm. But a Targaryen alone cannot stand. You must rally the North, keep their loyalties. Blood ties bind you to House Stark as much as House Targaryen." Jon inhaled the cold air, trying to steady himself. "You want me to abandon the wall?" "I do," the maester said, voice tremulous with emotion. "Sometimes we must choose which vow to honor. The vow to protect the realm can transcend the vow to remain at the wall. You cannot protect the realm if you stay in darkness. Go to Winterfell, speak to your brother, your cousin, Robb Stark, and decide how best to answer the Lannisters' treachery." Everything in Jon's body trembled with conflicting emotions. Guilt for betraying the Night's Watch, fury at the Lannisters, sorrow for Ned, and a rising sense of purpose that he could not deny. He gave a firm nod. That night, he gathered his meager belongings. His brothers in black watched him silently, many bearing expressions of pity or sadness. Yet no one raised a weapon to stop him. Perhaps they understood that if a man's father was executed, that same man might be called to redress that wrong no matter the cost. Castle Black's massive gates opened, and Jon Snow, now realizing he might truly be Aegon Targaryen, rode away into the frosty gloom, ghost a pale shadow at his side. Winterfell loomed on the horizon. Even cloaked in ice and winter's breath, the castle was a beacon for Jon. This place he had known as a child. He had grown up here among the Starks, some more welcoming than others. Lady Catelyn had never been fond of his presence, but Robb, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Rickon had been closer to him than any siblings he had known at the Wall. Would they still accept him, bastard or not? He passed the old Godswood, where the heart tree's face seemed carved into a silent expression of sorrow and compassion. As he neared the gate, the guards recognized him instantly. They exchanged looks of confusion, for none had expected Jon to appear wearing the black cloak of the Night's Watch but with vengeance in his eyes. They parted with respectful bows. There was something regal, almost commanding, in his presence they had never quite seen before. Jon dismounted, and a stable boy took his horse. He patted Ghost on the head and made his way inside. The courtyard bustled with activity. Men wearing House Stark livery preparing supplies, sharpening swords, mending leather. A sense of urgency permeated the air. The North was at war. Robb Stark had left with his army to confront Tywin Lannister's forces, or so the rumors said. A few of the older men bowed their heads when they saw Jon, as though seeing a reflection of Ned Stark in the younger man's solemn visage. Others whispered rumors of dragons returning or shadows stirring in the crypts beneath the keep. The war was forging strange alliances, stoking older fires long thought extinguished. Then a young page approached, breathless. "Sir Lord, we did not know you would be arriving. Lady Stark will see you in the Great Hall." Jon frowned. Lady Catelyn. He was not sure how she would greet him, especially after Ned's death. Would she resent him for being unable to save Ned? Would the new knowledge of his parentage make any difference? He suspected not. He had never yearned for her approval, but he hoped for something better than open hostility in these dark times. He moved through the corridors, reacquainting himself with the cold stone walls. Memories flickered, the faint echoes of his childhood steps chasing Robb around corners, Arya practicing with a wooden sword, Sansa's laughter mixing with the songs of traveling bards. The ghosts of happier times haunted him. Now the halls felt emptier. War had taken many of Winterfell's men south. He entered the Great Hall. At its far end, Lady Catelyn Stark stood wearing black mourning clothes. Her face was thin, drawn with sorrow. On her right stood the towering figure of Great Jon Umber, arms folded across his massive chest. And on her left was Ser Roderick Castle. They all turned at once to regard Jon. The flickering torchlight illuminated the tension that seemed to hang like a physical weight. Catelyn's eyes took in Jon's cloak, the sword at his hip, and the ghostly direwolf at his feet. For a moment there was silence. Then she spoke, her voice steadier than Jon expected. "You have come back to us." Jon inclined his head respectfully. "I have, my lady." She blinked once, her composure wavering. "Robb has marched south. Word reached us that my lord husband—" Her voice caught, tears threatening to fall. She swallowed and continued. "That Ned was executed at the command of that wretched boy on the Iron Throne. It is a wound that will never heal." Her eyes settled on Jon, searching for something in his face. "You were at the wall. Now you are here. Why?" Jon took a breath. The Great Jon and Ser Roderick watched him intently. "I came to pledge myself to the fight against the Lannisters. Lord Eddard was... He was my father, as far as I ever knew. I cannot remain idle while his killers rule." Lady Stark's lips twitched into something that might have been the ghost of a smile or a sorrowful acceptance. "You speak honorably, bastard." She paused, then amended, "Jon." The habit of calling him bastard still weighed heavily between them, but her voice held less venom than before. "Yet you wear the black. Have you abandoned your vows?" "Yes," Jon said bluntly, his tone guarded. "I know it is treason to desert, but I cannot stand aside. My father is dead. My brother wages a war he may not be able to win alone." At this, the Great Jon let out a rumble of approval. "We need every sword we can get to deal with those golden lions. The king in the north will be glad to see another direwolf by his side." Jon hesitated, remembering the revelations from Maester Aemon. He was not merely a direwolf. He was a dragon by blood, a Stark only through Lyanna. But perhaps that knowledge would do more harm than good right now. He recalled Aemon's words, "You must rally the north, keep their loyalties." The north followed Starks, not Targaryens. Until the time was right, perhaps it would be best to remain Jon Snow, at least publicly. "It is not just my sword I bring," Jon said. "I bring knowledge from Maester Aemon. He has foreseen something, a coming darkness that threatens the realm." Lady Catelyn's gaze hardened. "And what good are prophecies when it's steel and cunning that wins wars?" A trace of bitterness lingered, but Jon steadied himself, wishing to say more. Before he could, the door opened behind him. A messenger, panting from a long ride, stepped into the hall. "My lady, news from the Trident. Robb Stark has scored a victory against the Lannisters, capturing the Kingslayer himself." A spark of hope flickered in Lady Catelyn's eyes. For a moment, her grief waned. "Jaime Lannister is a prisoner?" "Yes, my lady, but Lord Tywin's forces regroup. There may be a counterattack." The Great Jon let out a booming laugh. "The young wolves got the Kingslayer in irons. The Lannisters will be howling." Jon's heart thudded at the news. At least Robb was proving himself in battle. "Where is Robb now?" he asked. "Camped near the twins. He'll likely move south soon," answered the messenger. "He awaits reinforcements from the north." Lady Catelyn's shoulders straightened. "Then that is where we must direct our energies. Prepare the men. I will ride to join my son in a fortnight at most." Jon took a step forward. "I would ride there now, my lady. I can scout ahead, avoid detection, and find my way to my brother's camp. I have Ghost. He can move silently in the night." Catelyn regarded him warily. "Your presence. Cannot say how Robb will greet you, but if you wish to fight for him, to avenge Ned, then I will not stop you. Take fresh horses. Rest the night." Jon nodded. "Thank you, my lady." He turned to leave, but Lady Stark called after him, her voice softer. "Jon." He turned back. She inhaled, eyes shining with sorrow. "Ned, he cared for you deeply. He would be glad to see you fight for the North." The unexpected warmth of her words struck Jon like a blow to the chest. He nodded once more, not trusting himself to speak, then exited. The great Jon followed, slapping Jon on the back as though he were any other Stark bannerman. It felt odd, being accepted so readily, but Jon saw that in these times of war, the lines between friend and foe blurred. If he could wield a sword for Ned's memory, that was enough for most. Night fell, the moonlight illuminating Winterfell in a serene silver glow. Jon could not sleep. He wandered through the courtyard, letting Ghost roam freely. An urge pulled him toward the crypts beneath the castle, a place he had rarely visited since childhood. Something, call it Targaryen blood, or the half-remembered voice of his Stark ancestors, urged him to descend into the darkness. He found the entrance, the lantern he carried casting shifting shadows along the walls. As a boy, these passages had frightened him. The statues of dead Starks, carved to watch over the tombs, seemed almost alive. Tonight, each step echoed like a heartbeat, reverberating along ancient stone. Deeper and deeper he went, passing the tombs of lords long past. He stopped briefly at Ned Stark's newly carved effigy. The sculpture was incomplete, lacking some final chiseling. His chest tightened. He set a hand against the stone, murmuring a silent vow of vengeance. Ghost let out a low growl, hackles rising. Jon stiffened. "What is it?" The dire wolf padded forward, nose to the ground, following a scent. With careful steps, Jon followed, the lantern revealing archways and alcoves he had never noticed. An unexpected breeze rustled the hair at the back of his neck, carrying with it a faint heat, impossible so far beneath Winterfell, a place typically chilled to the bone. The further they went, the warmer it grew, until, at last, Jon stepped into a chamber hidden behind an ancient wall that had partially collapsed. His breath caught. The chamber was massive, natural rather than constructed, more like a cavern that had been absorbed into Winterfell's foundation. Stalactites glittered overhead, and in the center, coiled like a living nightmare, lay a colossal black dragon. Jon froze, every hair on his body standing upright. He had grown up hearing tales of dragons, creatures of legend, destroyed after Robert's rebellion. This one was alive, albeit unnaturally still, its scales reflecting the flicker of Jon's lantern in oily sheen. Its eyes were closed, breath so slow and deep that it seemed almost entombed. A faint red glow seeped from the cracks in the ground near it, like molten rock or the embers of a sleeping forge. The dragon's breathing was the source of the warmth that radiated through the cavern. Ghost let out a growl, but it was tinged with awe and fear. Jon felt the same. Then his eyes moved beyond the sleeping beast. Nestled in a nook of rock, he saw 5 obsidian-colored eggs, each one the size of a man's helmet. He stepped closer, cautiously, hardly daring to breathe. The black dragon stirred, eyelids fluttering open to reveal molten gold irises. A deep rumble, older than Winterfell itself, reverberated in the cavern. Jon froze, expecting a rush of flame, but the dragon only watched him, its gaze unreadable. Was this the vision Maester Aemon had seen? The black wings in the darkness, the eggs waiting to be born into the world? Jon's heart thundered. He felt not fear, but a strange kinship with the beast, as though something in his blood recognized it. A Targaryen always had some link to dragons, if the old tales were true. Rhaegar had believed in prophecy, in the songs of ice and fire. Jon did not know how to speak to such a creature, or if it even understood him. yet somehow he knew that it recognized him. Slowly, Jon lowered his lantern, letting the pale light wash across him. The dragon's gaze shifted to Ghost, then back to Jon. A single puff of heated air escaped the creature's nostrils. The beast seemed neither hostile nor welcoming, only watchful. Carefully, Jon reached out with his free hand, not daring to move too close. He could feel the heat radiating from scales as dark as midnight. By the gods, he thought, how long has it slept here beneath Winterfell? The crypts were built over natural hot springs. Could that warmth have sustained a dragon in a centuries-long slumber? Or was this some newly awoken creature, come from the depths of the world? The dragon's mouth parted slightly, revealing curved teeth as thick as daggers. Jon retreated a pace, but did not flee. Curiosity wrestled with caution. The realization dawned that if the North had a dragon, then the game had changed completely. Dragons had once been the ultimate weapons of war, forging the Seven Kingdoms into one realm under House Targaryen. If Jon was truly a Targaryen, it made a strange, terrifying sense that fate would reveal such a beast to him. The eggs, too, fascinated him. 5. Enough for 5 more dragons if they could be hatched. The possibilities swirled in Jon's mind, immense and daunting. But first, he had to see Robb to tell him what he had discovered. If the king in the north and a Targaryen with a dragon joined forces, perhaps the Lannisters would stand no chance. Yet there was caution to be had. The North had fought a bitter rebellion against Jon's father and House Targaryen. Even if Jon was half Stark, would they accept dragons? Or would they see him as a threat? He stepped back carefully, never taking his eyes off the black dragon. The creature watched but did not move to follow or attack. After several long moments, Jon turned and slipped out of the hidden cavern, Ghost trotting warily at his side. Once they were back in the main crypt, Jon felt a wave of relief wash over him. His heart hammered, but a sense of inexorable destiny crept in, as if the gods themselves had orchestrated this moment. Tomorrow he would ride south to join Robb, but he would return soon. He would return for the dragon. Dawn broke over Winterfell. Jon made preparations to depart as quietly as possible. He wore the dark leathers he had used at the wall, with a fresh mount provided by Lady Catelyn. Ghost loped beside him. The knowledge of the dragon burned like a flame in his mind, but he told no one, not even Lady Catelyn. He knew what chaos such a revelation might cause, and he was not yet sure how to harness such power. As he was about to mount, Lady Catelyn approached. She held out a small bundle wrapped in fur. "This was Ned's," she said softly. "A map of the northern roads, marked with his notes. Perhaps it will help you find Robb quicker." Jon bowed his head, accepting the gift. "Thank you." A moment of silence passed, then Lady Catelyn spoke again. "Bring my girls home safe if you can, Jon. I do not even know where Arya is. Sansa is still in the clutches of the Lannisters. If you find any news..." She trailed off, her eyes swimming with tears. Jon felt a surge of protective fury. "I will do what I can," he promised, knowing that might not be enough. But he meant every word. He mounted his horse. With a final glance at Winterfell's walls, he spurred the animal on, Ghost keeping pace in a graceful lope. The wind whipped his hair, the crisp morning air clearing his mind. He did not look back again. Let the path ahead reveal itself. Riding hard, Jon made good time. He veered away from the main roads when possible, fearing Lannister scouts might lurk. The land grew more war-torn as he neared the riverlands. Villages had been burned, fields trampled. Occasional columns of smoke rose on the horizon. Refugees trudged along roads, seeking safety wherever they might find it. War had come, as it always did, devouring peasants and lords alike. Along the way, Jon helped where he could. He shared some salted meat with a displaced family. He warned travelers of bandits. His black cloak made some fear him as a deserter, but others begged for the Night's Watch to protect them. Even so, Jon could hardly explain the truth, that he was no mere black brother, that he was riding south to fight in a war that was, by all rights, not the Night's Watch's concern. At last, after many days, He came upon a clearing where the Stark banners flew. Tall pine trees opened onto a broad field dotted with tents and cooking fires. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow on the steel and leather of the assembled host. Wolves howled in the distance, a sound that always made Jon's pulse quicken. He urged his horse forward, bracing himself for what reception he might receive. Men called out as he approached, swords half drawn at the sight of a lone rider. Jon raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am Jon Snow, son bastard of Eddard Stark," he announced. "I come to see the king in the north." That caused a stir. Some recognized him by face or name. Others eyed him warily, uncertain of what to do with a black brother at their gates. A guard eventually took him to the center of the camp, where an imposing tent stood with the direwolf sigil flapping in the breeze. The sound of men arguing rose from within, voices competing for dominance. Then a tall man with auburn hair strode out. It was Robb Stark. He looked older, more worn than Jon remembered. His face bore new lines of worry, though he still possessed the same determined eyes. Robb halted in surprise when he saw Jon. He blinked, then a cautious smile spread across his face. "Jon, what are you doing here? You're part of the Night's Watch. Did something happen at the wall?" Jon dismounted, letting Ghost circle around. "A great many things have happened, Robb. We need to talk." Robb looked over Jon's shoulder, as if expecting others. "Is Maester Aemon with you? Did you come alone?" Jon nodded gravely. "Alone. May we speak in private?" Robb's eyes flicked to a group of his bannermen who lingered nearby, curiosity etched on their faces. Then he gestured for Jon to follow him into the tent. Inside, maps lay spread across a wooden table, figures representing troop placements scattered over a detailed depiction of the Riverlands. Jon recognized the sigils of House Bolton, Karstark, Umber, Glover, most of the great houses of the north. Grey Wind, Robb's direwolf, lay near the entrance, head lifting at the intrusion, ears pricking at the sight of Ghost. The two direwolves locked eyes in a silent greeting. As soon as the tent flaps closed, Robb turned to Jon, expression guarded. "Out with it. Why are you here?" Jon set a hand on the edge of the map table, steadying himself. "I learned of Father's death. I could not remain at the wall. I deserted." Robb's face twitched with conflicting emotions. "Desertion is punishable by death. You know that." Jon met his gaze. "I do." They stood in silence for a moment, two young men shaped by the same father and the same frigid homeland, now confronted with the brutal reality of war and law. Then Robb's shoulders relaxed fractionally. "I'm not going to kill you," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I need all the loyal men I can get. If you fight with me, that's enough, though some of my bannermen may protest." Jon nodded in gratitude. "I am here to fight. For the North. For Ned. But there is something else you need to know." Robb raised an eyebrow, his posture tense. "Speak, then." Jon glanced around, ensuring no one else was within earshot. Grey Wind watched him, unblinking. Ghost settled beside Jon, tail curled around his paws. Taking a breath, Jon said, "Maester Aemon told me the truth of my parentage. Ned Stark was not my father. My mother was Lyanna Stark, and my father was Rhaegar Targaryen." Robb's eyes went wide. For a moment, he looked at Jon as though Jon had gone mad. Then his lips parted in a half scoff, half laugh. "That's not possible." But even as he said it, doubt flickered across his features. If there was anyone who knew Ned Stark's capacity for secrets, it was the children he raised. Ned had never spoken of Jon's mother, never so much as hinted at her identity. Robb might recall the hush that fell whenever the subject was broached. Jon explained, voice trembling slightly. "Maester Aemon had a vision. He said I am Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar and Lyanna. That Ned kept me safe all these years, to hide me from Robert Baratheon's wrath." "It explains much." Robb paced, running a hand through his hair. "If this is true, it could change everything. If you are truly a Targaryen." He closed his eyes, recalling that the North had rebelled against the Mad King. that the Targaryens had been cast down by Robert's rebellion, in part because of Rhaegar's alleged kidnapping of Lyanna. And if you are also Lyanna's son, then you're still my cousin. You have Stark blood. Jon forced a thin smile. Part of me fears to speak of it at all. The North might reject me as Targaryen scum. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Robb exhaled, tension thrumming through his frame. You did right by telling me, but I don't know how our bannermen will react if they find out. Gods, Jon Aegon, this war is complicated enough. The Lannisters hold King's Landing, and now you tell me we have a Targaryen in our midst. Jon nodded slowly, dropping another bombshell. There's more. Beneath Winterfell, I found a living dragon, a huge black beast, sleeping under the crypts in a hidden cavern. And there are 5 eggs. Robb's face went pale. He looked as though Jon had just claimed the moon was made of cheese. A dragon? Under Winterfell? Jon, is this some fever dream? I saw it with my own eyes. Ask Ghost. He was there too, Jon said, though he knew how incredulous it all sounded. I can't explain how it survived or why it's there, but it lives. If I can learn to command it, it might turn the tide of this war. Robb paced more rapidly. This is... He paused, collecting himself. If you truly have a dragon, it could be the key to destroying the Lannisters once and for all. But the North has always hated dragons and Targaryens. Our ancestors, our fathers, fought to overthrow them. Jon grimaced. I know, but this Targaryen is also a Stark by blood. Perhaps that will matter. Or perhaps we can keep it secret until we need it most. Robb pressed his lips together. Word might leak. Secrets rarely stay hidden. But if it's a choice between letting the Lannisters run rampant or taking help from a dragon, some might be swayed. Jon's eyes flashed with conviction. We cannot let them murder more of our family. Ned is gone. Sansa is in their hands, and Arya's fate is unknown. The Lannisters must pay. Give me a chance to prove myself in battle, Robb. Let me stand by your side. Then, when the time is right, we'll bring the dragon north. Robb regarded Jon in silence. A heavy moment passed between them, filled with years of shared brotherhood, camaraderie, and now a new kind of distance. Finally, Robb extended his hand. Fight with me as Jon Snow, Ned Stark's son. For now, we won't speak of Targaryen blood. When the time comes, if we must reveal the dragon, we will do it together. Agreed. Jon clasped his hand, feeling a surge of relief and purpose. Agreed. In the days that followed, Jon discovered he was something of an odd figure in the camp. Many soldiers recognized him as the rumored bastard of Winterfell, come to fight for the king in the north. Some whispered that he had deserted the Night's Watch. Others claimed that he must have had Ned Stark's blessing, or that the old gods themselves allowed it because of the Lannisters' betrayal. Most accepted him with a nod and a grunt, especially after seeing how deftly he handled a blade. Jon took part in strategy councils. He said little at first, preferring to learn how Robb and his advisors planned their campaigns. The young wolf's victories on the field had earned him a fierce reputation, yet Jon could see the burden on Robb's shoulders. They faced the might of House Lannister, with all its gold and influence, and the cunning of Lord Tywin. Still, the North's morale was high after taking Jaime Lannister prisoner. Some men boasted they would march all the way to King's Landing, dethrone Joffrey, and put the traitors' heads on spikes. But Jon's heart remained heavy, torn between thoughts of the men he'd left behind at the wall, the vision of the dragon beneath Winterfell, and the uncertain future of his sisters. He spent quiet evenings with Grey Wind and Ghost outside his tent, the two direwolves forming a silent bond. At times, Robb joined him, and they spoke of old days. Mock duels in the courtyard, teasing Arya for climbing the walls, Sansa's songs, Bran's fascination with stories of knights and heroes. Then the conversation would circle back to their father, to the cruelty of Joffrey, and the uncertain times they lived in. One night, as they huddled over a small cookfire, Robb confided, "The River Lords have joined my cause, but we're stretched thin. Tywin's forces regroup. Roose Bolton leads men south from the Dreadfort, but I trust him only so far. We must strike again soon, break their lines before they can unite. I'd hoped Renly Baratheon might aid us or Stannis, but both are entangled in their own claims for the throne. Jon stared into the dancing flames. If we bring the dragon from Winterfell, will that tip the balance? Robb shot him a sharp glance. Perhaps, but can you truly control it? Do you even know how? Jon swallowed. No, not yet. I need time. Time to speak with Maester Aemon, or perhaps search for old Targaryen scrolls. I can't just walk up to the beast and demand it obey me. Robb nodded grimly. Then we fight as we are for now. When the moment is dire enough, we'll take a small retinue north. Perhaps Theon Greyjoy can sail us quickly to White Harbor, and from there we slip into Winterfell. At the mention of Theon, Jon's expression darkened. He remembered Theon Greyjoy from their youth, arrogant, prone to idle boasts. He was Robb's friend, but a hostage of House Stark as well. Jon had never fully trusted him, yet he held his tongue. Distrust between allies would only weaken them further. Time in camp was a whirlwind of training, scouting missions, and hurried councils. Jon saw how were changed men. Once gentle souls hardened, eyes filled with a grim determination. The daily reports of Lannister brutality, villages looted, peasants tortured, outrages committed, fueled a thirst for vengeance. Robb's northern host yearned for another great victory, something to rival the capture of Jaime Lannister. At last, that opportunity came. Scouts reported that Lord Tywin had made camp along the banks of the Red Fork, near a place where the river was fordable. If they moved swiftly, the northern army could catch Tywin's force unaware, forcing him into battle at a disadvantage. The plan was riskier than usual, for Tywin was known to be a master tactician. Yet Robb believed the element of surprise might carry them through. In the War Council, the northern lords debated strategies, some clamoring for a bold strike, others urging caution. Roose Bolton advocated a feint to lure Tywin's men into a trap. Lord Karstark wanted a night assault, citing the advantage of direwolves in the dark. Lady Meage Mormont spoke of the Bear Island archers who could harass the Lannister flanks. Robb listened, nodding, then laid out his plan. We'll have our outriders create false signals to the north, drawing Tywin's scouts away. Then we cross the river by night, using our best swimmers first to secure the far bank. Once the crossing is established, our main force will hit Tywin's encampment on two sides. We strike at dawn, while they're still exhausted and half-blind from the night. The assembled lords agreed. Jon listened closely, offering input only when asked. Inside, his heart pounded. Tomorrow, he would meet the Lannisters in open battle. Would he freeze at the sight of their lions, their gold armor glinting, memories of Ned's fate overtaking him? Or would he find new strength in his identity, in the knowledge that he was more than just Jon Snow? That evening, Jon sharpened Longclaw, the Valyrian steel sword given to him by Lord Commander Mormont. The sword's pommel was shaped like a wolf's head, carved from pale stone. He felt the power in the blade, a heritage that once seemed like an honor from House Mormont. Now he carried the silent hope that it would be enough to stand against the might of Lannister steel. Ghost dozed beside him, ears twitching. Robb stepped into Jon's tent, gray wind at his side. For a moment, they exchanged a solemn look, two young men on the cusp of bloodshed. "Ready?" Robb asked softly. Jon nodded, testing the edge with his thumb. "I will not fail you." Robb's expression was grim, yet there was a flicker of fraternal affection in his eyes. "We stand together, brother, cousin, whatever you are. Just try not to let the Lannisters kill you." Jon managed a tight smile. "I'll do my best." They clasped forearms, a fierce bond forged by loyalty, blood, and the memory of the man they had both loved and lost. The night was moonless, perfect for concealment. The army moved like a swarm of shadows, crossing the Red Fork in small groups, guided by torches partially shielded with cloth. The water was cold, but the men of the north were accustomed to colder. They fought the current with gritted teeth, muffling curses under their breath. Dire wolves padded silently on the banks, sniffing the air. Jon crossed with the advance party, water sloshing around his thighs as he clutched Longclaw. He emerged on the opposite side, soaked to the bone, and crouched behind a fallen log. The distant glow of the Lannister encampment flickered through the trees. He could hear the faint sounds of men talking, horses neighing. The wind carried the stink of campfires and latrines. One of Robb's bannermen, Lord Rickard Karstark, squatted beside Jon, whispering, "We take out their sentries first, quietly. Once our main force assembles, we strike." Jon nodded, heart hammering. He felt a primal thrill, a savage anticipation. If they succeeded, they might deal a devastating blow to Lord Tywin himself. If they failed, the realm would see the Lannisters' vengeance. He looked at Ghost, who gazed back with glimmering red eyes. "Stay close," Jon murmured. The signal came in the form of an owl's low hoot. The Karstark men moved out, silent as wraiths. Jon followed, stepping carefully among the wet leaves. He spotted the silhouette of a Lannister sentry by a torch. The man was yawning, his helm tilted back. Before the sentry realized, a Karstark man slid a dirk across his throat. The sentry's lifeblood gurgled away, and the body crumpled without a cry. Jon witnessed the lethal efficiency of northern blades in the darkness. Years of forging their bodies in the harsh winter climate now paid dividends. They eliminated the watchmen one by one. Fear coiled in Jon's gut. This was no glorious contest, no heroic charge. It was death delivered in silence. Yet he steeled himself, remembering Ned's lifeless face on the steps of the Great September. If the Lannisters wanted war, the North would bring it. The hush was broken by a sudden shout. Then another. A sentry had discovered a body. The alarm spread like wildfire through the camp. Torches flared, horns bellowed, chaos erupted. Robb's plan to attack at dawn was forced to commence early. A wave of northern soldiers poured through the trees, roaring their battle cries. "The king in the north!" they shouted. Steel clashed, men screamed, horses stampeded. Jon found himself in the midst of the tumult, Longclaw flashing in the firelight. A Lannister soldier lunged at him with a spear. Jon parried, sparks flying. Ghost snarled, leaping onto another man, dragging him down. Jon pivoted, slicing through leather and chainmail. The soldier fell, crying out. Blood sprayed the damp ground. Gray wind barreled past, savage jaws snapping at retreating foes. The entire night seemed painted in red and black, lit by the glow of flames licking at canvas tents. Frenzied, disjointed battles broke out across the camp. Jon glimpsed Robb at the center, swinging his sword in a deadly arc. The king in the north fought with a determined ferocity, gray wind an extension of his wrath. Northern archers loosed arrows from the rear, showering the Lannisters with deadly volleys. Men screamed. Tents caught fire, the acrid scent of burning fabric choking the air. A heavy-set knight in golden armor charged at Jon, warhammer raised high. Jon ducked, feeling the air whoosh as the hammer passed overhead. He drove Longclaw upward, piercing the knight's armor at a vulnerable gap below the breastplate. The knight fell with a ragged gasp. Another rushed him, but Ghost lunged, ripping at the soldier's calf. Jon finished him with a quick thrust, heart pounding like a war drum. It was a storm of carnage. Jon had never known such chaos. At Castle Black, battles were more disciplined, or at least more limited. This was wholesale slaughter, a swirling mass of steel, blood, and screams. Yet his senses were alive, hyper-focused. Each time he blocked a blade, each time he struck true, he felt a savage clarity, a sense that he was fulfilling a dark purpose. Somewhere in the fray, a horn sounded, low and mournful. It signaled the Lannister retreat. Tywin's men, caught off guard, were disorganized, many already dead or wounded. Some tried to regroup near the river, but the North pursued with relentless fury. Robb had commanded that they capture who they could. There was value in Lannister hostages, but the Red Fork ran red with blood, and many Lannister men drowned in their attempt to flee. By dawn, the northern host stood victorious. Bodies of the fallen lay strewn across the camp, both Lannister and Stark men. Smoke rose from the remnants of burned tents. Jon's sword arm felt heavy, muscles throbbing with exertion. He looked for Robb and found him near the central fire pit, breathing hard, sword dripping with gore. Grey Wind stood guard, muzzle stained crimson. A hush fell as Robb's bannermen took stock of the battlefield. Then, gradually, cheers rose among the ranks. The king in the north had won another resounding victory. Men hoisted their swords, chanting Robb's name. Jon knelt beside a wounded Stark soldier, helping wrap a gash on the man's leg. The man groaned in pain, but clutched Jon's forearm gratefully. Around them, others did the same, caring for the wounded, dragging away the dead. War was not glorious, Jon realized. It was a grim necessity, a savage dance that left the living broken in its aftermath. Amid the tumult, Robb found Jon, clasping a hand on his shoulder. "You fought well," Robb said, breath ragged. "I saw you cut down 3 Lannisters. Father would have been proud." Jon swallowed hard, hearing a distant echo of Ned Stark's voice in his mind. Then Robb's expression grew sober. "We have more plans to make. Tywin himself escaped according to our scouts, but his army is shattered." Jon nodded, rising to follow Robb through the carnage. The North was victorious here, but the war was far from over. The Lannisters still held King's Landing, Sansa, and the Iron Throne. Tywin was still alive. Joffrey would not relinquish his stolen crown easily, and Jon carried the secret of a sleeping dragon beneath Winterfell, a hidden power that might change the course of history. In the days after the battle, Northern morale soared, bolstered by another triumph. But any illusions of a swift conclusion to the war were dispelled by new reports arriving by Raven. The Lannisters had called more banners, and the Crown's forces were consolidating near Harrenhal. Meanwhile, King's Landing remained a fortress of influence, with the gold of House Lannister funding Joffrey's rule. In Robb's war tent, a council assembled. The great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and a handful of other northern lords. They studied the map, discussing potential strikes against Harrenhal or even a push toward the capital. Some argued they should entrench in the Riverlands, awaiting Lannister aggression. Others wanted to press forward relentlessly. Jon stood in a corner, observing. He knew his place was precarious. He was not officially a lord. Then Robb spoke up. "My lords, we have inflicted heavy losses on Tywin. He's unlikely to rush into another pitched battle. However, we cannot maintain a prolonged siege of King's Landing without more allies. Renly and Stannis both claim the Iron Throne. Neither has yet marched north to aid us. Balon Greyjoy remains on Pike, building his own power." Roose Bolton's pale eyes flicked toward Jon briefly. "We should move swiftly to retake Harrenhal. Deny Tywin the advantage of that fortress. Let the Frey support our supply lines through the Twins." The great Jon bellowed. "Aye, and if Tywin wants to come out and fight again, we'll feed him another defeat." Rickard Karstark, face haunted by the loss of his sons, spoke grimly. "And what of Jaime Lannister, our prisoner? Should we not use him to negotiate for Sansa's release?" Robb's expression darkened. "Perhaps, but Joffrey has proven he cares little for Sansa's well-being. I fear for her, but Jaime is too great a prize to barter lightly. We need a bigger plan." Jon stepped forward, voice calm but determined. "A bigger plan, like a dragon." Silence fell. A few of the lords exchanged confused glances. Robb exhaled, clearing his throat. "It's true. We may have a weapon that could turn the tide of this war, but it is uncertain, dangerous even. I have discussed it with Jon. Before we commit to any plan involving it, we must be certain." "Surely you don't mean—" Karstark began, but Robb cut him off. "My lords, I cannot yet reveal all the details," Robb said, projecting authority. "What I can say is that Jon needs to make a journey north. I intend to send a small force with him to Winterfell. We cannot abandon our seat entirely, but we must investigate a matter of great importance." The lords seemed unsatisfied, but Robb's gaze was firm. The king in the north had earned their respect through his victories. The great Jon shrugged. Whatever secret you're hiding better be worth 1,000 swords, boy. Roose Bolton nodded slowly, though something cunning flickered in his eyes. As you say, your grace. Jon wondered if Bolton suspected something more, but the man said no more. After the council, Robb dismissed the lords, leaving Jon alone with him. Robb spoke quietly. Go north, Jon. Find a way to wake that dragon, control it. I will maintain pressure on the Lannisters here, but be swift. Jon clasped Robb's arm. I'll do everything I can. If we can bond with it, the Lannisters won't stand a chance. A flicker of a smile crossed Robb's tired face. I hope you're right, brother. A fortnight later, Jon departed the camp with a small retinue. Men loyal to House Stark, several of whom had served in Winterfell. He left Ghost with Robb for the time being, as Grey Wind and Ghost together were a formidable force for scouting and intimidation. Instead, Jon took 4 men and the necessary supplies for a swift ride north. They were careful to avoid Lannister patrols, skirting the main roads whenever possible. Along the journey, Jon pondered how he might speak to the dragon, how Targaryens of old had bound these creatures to their will. Songs spoke of horns and whips, of magic and dragon lore lost to time. Jon had only the faintest notion that some Targaryens formed near telepathic bonds with their dragons, forging a connection through blood. He prayed that, if he truly was Rhaegar's son, that same affinity might lie within him. At last, Winterfell's ancient walls rose before them. Jon felt a warmth in his chest at the sight of home, mingled with the heaviness of all that had changed. Inside, the courtyard was quieter than when he had left. Lady Catelyn was absent. She had ridden south to be with Robb. The small garrison left behind welcomed Jon and his men. They were relieved to see a Stark presence return, even if he was only the bastard. None knew of his Targaryen claim, and for that Jon was grateful. Secrets best remain hidden until the right moment. That evening, Jon descended alone into the crypts, lantern in hand. He followed the path he remembered, stepping over rubble and winding through corridors until he reached the collapsed wall leading to the hidden cavern. He could almost feel the dragon's presence, a latent power humming in the depths. The air grew hotter, stifling. With each step, his heart thumped louder. At last, he entered the cavern. The black dragon was there, coiled in a different position than before, as if it had stirred during his absence. Its eyes were half-lidded, glowing faintly. The cluster of 5 eggs remained. Steam or smoke rose from fissures in the cavern floor, adding an otherworldly quality to the scene. Jon approached slowly, setting the lantern on a rock outcropping. The dragon opened its eyes fully, a low rumble resonating in the air. Jon kept his hands visible, non-threatening. He tried to calm his breathing, remembering the stories of Aegon, the Conqueror's bond with Balerion the Black Dread. This dragon was black like Balerion. Was it possible this was some descendant or ancient remnant? He spoke softly. I am Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen by blood. The dragon's eyes glinted gold at the mention of Targaryen. I come to seek your help, your alliance, to bring justice to those who have wronged my family. The dragon listened, or so it seemed, its head tilting slightly. Jon inched forward, close enough to feel the sweltering heat. He held out a trembling hand, palm open. The dragon inhaled, nostrils flaring, as though sampling Jon's scent. The rumble continued, vibrating through Jon's chest. Jon's mind raced. How could he communicate the bond he desired? He thought of the direwolves and how the Stark children had each formed a connection with their wolf. The bond was not spoken but felt. Perhaps the same principle applied to dragons. Tentatively, he reached deeper, summoning every ounce of courage and every shred of Targaryen blood he possessed. He focused on the sorrow of Ned's death, the fury at the Lannisters, the love he bore for his siblings, and the thirst for justice. He let those emotions flood through him, hoping the dragon could sense his intent. For a moment, it appeared the dragon might snap at him. Its jaw parted, revealing a maw of scorching breath. Then, slowly, it lowered its massive head, allowing Jon's hand to press gently against warm scales. The texture was rough, ridged, like ancient stone shaped by volcanic fire. A surge of heat passed into Jon's palm, almost unbearable, yet he did not flinch. He locked eyes with the creature, feeling an inexplicable resonance, as though an ember of shared consciousness flickered between them. He heard nothing, no voice in his head, but the sense of kinship was undeniable. The dragon rumbled again, softer this time, a thunderous purr. Jon exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He dared a gentle stroke along the dragon's scales, a gesture of trust. Minutes passed in that surreal communion. Finally, Jon stepped back. He glanced at the eggs, perfect ovals of obsidian black, each emanating a subtle heat of its own. Could they be hatched? Or would they remain dormant unless some arcane ritual awoke them? He recalled the tale of Daenerys Targaryen, who had hatched eggs in a funeral pyre. But that was across the narrow sea in a different age. Jon's knowledge was limited. Nevertheless, the existence of these eggs in the north, with a living dragon to protect them, was a marvel beyond reckoning. If just one more dragon hatched, the balance of power in the Seven Kingdoms would shift dramatically. Perhaps that was what Maester Aemon's vision foretold. Dragons rising once more, not from the scorching deserts of Essos, but from the cold crypts of Winterfell, uniting fire and ice in a single symbol. Jon stood before the mighty beast, heart pounding with possibilities. The realm was on the brink of the greatest upheaval since Aegon's conquest. He was not Ned Stark's bastard anymore, but a king's son, caught in the swirling tides of prophecy, war, and ancient magic. The North rallied under Robb, but Robb did not bend the knee to Jon. They were allies, not liege and subject, a union of wolf and dragon. Starks and Targaryens joined to destroy the Lannisters. And beneath the heart of Winterfell lay the living proof of a power that had once shaped the world. Jon looked upon the black dragon's molten gaze, the eggs that held the future, and he felt a tremor of destiny. The time for vengeance had come. Soon, the Lion of Lannister would feel the wrath of the wolf and the dragon combined. And in that forging, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, would either rise to meet his fate or be destroyed by it. He placed his hand on the dragon's snout again, locking eyes with the creature that had slept through centuries of winter. A silent promise passed between them. War was coming, and the dragon would fly again. Jon stood alone in the cavern for a long time, one hand resting on the black dragon's snout, the other clenched at his side in trembling awe. The enormity of what he had discovered in the darkness beneath Winterfell nearly overwhelmed him. This was no small magic or accidental fluke of nature. An ancient beast had slumbered here, sustained by the warmth of the hot springs and the deep mysteries of the north. And now it seemed to accept his touch, as if it sensed the Targaryen blood coursing through his veins. The dragon blinked slowly, a majestic creature of coal-black scales, its eyes pools of molten gold that reflected torchlight like tiny, dancing suns. A distant, muffled rumble shivered through its broad chest, resonating in Jon's bones. He let the silence stretch before he carefully lowered his hand and took a step back, forcing himself to breathe evenly. Heat emanated from the dragon's flank, filling the cavern with thick, almost suffocating warmth. 5 eggs, glimmering black with faint swirls of red when the lantern light caught them, remained nestled near the dragon's tail. Jon felt a pull toward those eggs too, a quiet beckoning from the future they might unleash if ever they hatched. So much of his life had been shaped by secrets and half-truths. Now he stood on the precipice of an even greater secret, one that could reshape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. He swallowed, thinking of all that Maester Aemon had told him, that he was Aegon Targaryen, the hidden son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. He had wanted so desperately to be Ned Stark's child, to be worthy in the eyes of the only father he had ever known. Now the truth was different, but it did not erase the love or the lessons Ned had given him. And it did not erase his sense of loyalty to the North and to Robb Stark, his cousin and, once upon a time, his brother. Yet how would the North receive him if they learned of his Targaryen name and this colossal dragon hidden in Winterfell's depths? The dragon huffed, a short exhalation that disturbed the loose pebbles on the ground. Jon took that as an unspoken farewell and dipped his head in a gesture of respect. Then, retrieving his lantern, he retreated from the cavern and made his way back through the crypts. Each step along the cold stone corridors rattled through his mind, marking the start of a path he could not turn back from. When he finally emerged into the open air of the courtyard, the sun was setting, bathing Winterfell's battlements in hues of orange and crimson. A handful of men waited near the entrance to the crypts. Most were part of the small retinue Robb had allowed Jon to take north, trusted soldiers who had served under Ned or recognized Jon's worth on the battlefield. One of them, an older man named Herod, stepped forward, nerves evident in his posture. "My lord," he said quietly, "there have been whispers of strange roars at night. The garrison is on edge. Some have guessed there might be something lurking below. Is it true? What did you find?" Jon studied Herod's face. He saw fear and curiosity in equal measure. The other men listened intently, though none dared speak out of turn. Ghost was absent, back south with Robb and Grey Wind, so Jon stood alone. A cold wind ran through the courtyard, stirring his hair. He considered lying, but these were men who had risked their lives on the field for him. "I found an old power hidden beneath Winterfell," Jon said carefully. "A dragon, a living, breathing dragon that has slept there for the gods know how many years." Several of the men inhaled sharply, and one muttered a prayer to the old gods. Herod's eyes widened, and his face paled. "A dragon, my lord? But all the dragons died out after the doom of Valyria or soon after the Targaryens lost their throne." "How?" "I don't have all the answers," Jon said, cutting across the man's stammering. "But I do know that the North needs every advantage if we're to defeat the Lannisters. We will tell no one else of this until the time is right. If word spreads, we risk losing the element of surprise. Do you understand?" They nodded in unison, though Jon could sense the trembling excitement in their eyes. The notion of a dragon in the north seemed more like a myth than a reality. Yet he had felt its heat, touched its scales. It was real, and it belonged, strange as it sounded, to him. The men dispersed, exchanging muted whispers among themselves. Jon crossed the courtyard and climbed a stairwell to the old maester's tower. Maester Luwin was dead. So many tragedies had befallen Winterfell in different tellings of this war, but in the swirl of events since Ned's execution, the caretaker of Winterfell had also perished during an earlier skirmish with Ironborn raiders near the coast. The tower was mostly deserted now, used only for storing records and leftover tomes. If any knowledge about dragons remained in Winterfell, it would be here. He spent hours rifling through dusty shelves, scanning the spines of old parchments and crumbling books for any mention of Targaryens, dragons, or the lore that once allowed men to ride these beasts. He found references to Aegon the Conqueror, to his sisters Rhaenys and Visenya, to Balerion the Black Dread, Vhagar, Meraxes, but the texts offered few insights into how the Targaryens had first bound dragons to their will. The magic of old Valyria was half lost, locked away in forbidden tomes in the Citadel or scattered across Essos. At one point, he paused in frustration and closed his eyes, recalling Daenerys Targaryen's rumored hatching of 3 dragon eggs in a funeral pyre. That story was known to him, gleaned in bits from sworn brothers at the Wall who had served as stewards of information, reading letters from across the narrow sea. But how could he replicate such a thing here? The North was not the Dothraki Sea. Winterfell was not some scorching desert. And the black dragon beneath the crypts was no newly hatched creature. It was older, enormous, awake enough to glare at him with ancient eyes. If it had chosen to remain hidden, perhaps it possessed its own reasons. Perhaps it had been waiting for a Targaryen. The very thought made Jon's heart pound. Late into the night, he found an old scroll in a locked chest. The wax seal was broken, and the script had begun to fade. It described certain Targaryen rites, how the blood of the dragon sometimes awakened a bond, how the presence of king's blood and Valyrian steel might stir dormant energies. It was vague and referenced older texts that were not in the library. Still, Jon read it twice over, gleaning a single line that stuck with him. Where the warmth of the earth meets the cold of the heavens, only the dragon seed may awaken the flame. The words rang like a half-remembered prophecy, though he could not decipher its full meaning. He only knew that he had, through blood and circumstance, become one of these so-called dragon seeds. Exhausted, he finally retired to Ned Stark's old solar to catch a few hours of sleep. Winterfell's silent corridors felt unfamiliar without the hustle and laughter of the younger Stark children. Arya, Sansa, Bran, Rickon. Where were they now, scattered by war and tragedy? He shut his eyes and tried not to see Ned's final moment, the sword falling, Sansa's tear-streaked face. Rage and grief mingled with a fierce determination. For them, he would see this war ended. When morning arrived, pale sunlight spilled through the windows. Jon roused himself and went down to break his fast in the Great Hall. Only a skeleton garrison remained, mostly older soldiers and a few women who ran the kitchens and managed the supplies. They eyed him with open curiosity, for rumors spread quickly in a place as small as Winterfell. He could imagine the gossip. The bastard of Ned Stark returning with a secret mission, possibly harboring some dark power beneath the castle. If they only knew how literal that rumor was. He summoned his 4 men, Herod, Vicon, Torrin, and Lance, who had accompanied him from Robb's host. The night before, they had promised their silence about the dragon. Now Jon made sure to reinforce the importance of secrecy. They bowed their heads, though he the questions burning in their expressions. He could hardly blame them. The North was fighting a war on the lives of thousands, and this revelation could be a turning point or a curse. "We stay in Winterfell for a time," Jon said as they stood by the stables. "I need to learn more. There may be old scrolls or hidden knowledge here. The rest of you will keep watch on the gates and see to the castle's security. If anyone tries to slip out with rumors, detain them. No one must know of the dragon." The men nodded. Herod smoothed the gray streaks in his beard. "And if we see signs of trouble from the Ironborn or Lannister scouts, send word to me at once. We're not to engage unless absolutely necessary." Jon paused, then added more softly, "We hold Winterfell until Robb calls us south again or until I send word that we must act." He left them to their duties, returning to the library tower. Over the next week, he pored over the meager resources available. At night, lantern in hand, he ventured again into the crypts. Each time he found the black dragon awake, eyes glimmering in the darkness. Its presence unnerved him, yet he never wavered in approaching. On the second night, the dragon actually unfurled a portion of its great wings, stretching them across the cavern floor like a swath of living night. Jon felt an almost electric tingle in the air, as though the dragon recognized him more clearly each time. On the third night, he brought a slaughtered sheep from Winterfell's herds, dragging it through the crypts. With some trepidation, he offered it to the dragon. The beast sniffed at the carcass, then devoured it in a shocking display of raw power, crunching bones, ripping flesh, swallowing in massive gulps. The heat of its breath seared the air, forcing Jon to step back. When the dragon had finished, it lowered its head and made a low, guttural noise, as if sated. Jon took that as gratitude of a sort and dared to stroke its scales again. He felt the rapid drumming of its heartbeat beneath his fingertips, raw and fierce. He did not neglect the eggs. They radiated a faint heat of their own, throbbing like living entities waiting for a spark. But no matter how much he examined them, he could not tell if they were on the brink of hatching or as dormant as stone. Part of him wondered if he dared attempt some ritual, fire and blood, as the Targaryens were wont to say. But this was Winterfell, seat of House Stark. Could such southern magic be invoked here? Jon was so absorbed in these nightly visits that he was startled when, on the 10th day, a raven arrived from Robb. The letter was delivered by one of the garrison's old men, who found Jon in the great hall, poring over a steaming bowl of stew. Jon read the letter quickly, feeling his pulse quicken. Robb wrote that more battles had erupted near the Trident. Tywin Lannister had regrouped his forces, but the North's morale was still high. Lords Bolton and Karstark pressed for an assault on Harrenhal. Most critically, there was word that King Joffrey intended to parade Sansa Stark before the court, using her as a pawn to force concessions. The time to strike was nearing, but Robb needed every advantage, needed to shock Tywin's armies into retreat or submission. Jon swallowed, reading between the lines. Robb wanted the dragon, and he wanted it soon. The letter did not explicitly say so. Robb was too cautious to put such a secret into writing, but the references to the power we spoke of, and the advantage only you can secure, made it plain. The king in the north was counting on his cousin to bring forth a weapon unseen in Westeros for generations. Setting aside the letter, Jon gazed into the middle distance, the weight of duty bearing down on him. He had begun forging a tenuous connection with the dragon, but it was not as if he could saddle the creature and fly it to the trident tomorrow. He remembered old accounts that said Targaryen dragon riders had specific horns, bridles of steel and dragon bone, even spells. He had none of these, and yet the memory of setting his hand on those scales told him the bond might be more primal, built on trust and blood and something older than all the castles in Westeros. That evening, he gathered Harrod, Vicon, Torrhen, and Lance in the privacy of Ned Stark's solar. The windows overlooked Winterfell's snowy courtyard, where torches burned in the gloom. "I've received word from King Robb," Jon began, the words feeling odd in his mouth. "He is pressing the war against the Lannisters and needs us. Needs me." Harrod looked up from where he was polishing a dagger. "If he needs us, we ride south, yes? Why wait? Because our greatest asset isn't a host of men. It's the dragon below this castle." Jon folded his arms. "Robb implicitly wants me to bring it to the battlefield. But controlling a dragon isn't like leading a cavalry charge or commanding archers from a hill. I'm not sure how it can be done." Vicon, a middle-aged soldier with a scar across his chin, frowned. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but are we sure we can't just keep the beast caged up until the war is won? I've heard tales of dragons that ravaged entire armies, but also turned on their riders if slighted." Jon nodded. "That's precisely why I need time to form a bond. Each night I've been visiting it, feeding it. The creature hasn't shown hostility, but that doesn't mean it accepts me fully. And if it decides to rise in rage, it could burn Winterfell itself to the ground." Torrhen exchanged a glance with Lance, then quietly said, "But if you could master it, my lord, the Lannisters wouldn't stand a chance." Jon took a breath. "Exactly. We have to try. But we also need to protect Winterfell should anything go wrong. I've taken steps to keep this secret, but rumors might still leak. If the Ironborn get wind of a dragon in the north, or the Lannisters, they'll send forces to capture or destroy it. We must remain vigilant." The men agreed, though Jon could see the apprehension on their faces. This was no straightforward campaign with shield walls and pikes. It was a venture into half-mythic territory, the stuff of old ballads and nightmares. Yet they swore they would stand by him, trusting in his loyalty to the Stark name and the memory of Ned. That night, Jon descended once more into the crypts, this time carrying not only fresh meat, but also Longclaw strapped at his hip, along with a torch that sputtered in the stale air. The black dragon lay coiled in a semicircle, eyes shut, yet when Jon's boots scraped the stone, they flicked open. The golden gaze pinned him instantly. He set the meat down carefully and waited, letting the dragon sniff and devour the offering. Then, as the beast feasted, Jon slowly moved closer to its head. The dragon let him approach. Its formidable jaws clamped down on the remains of the meal, and Jon tried not to flinch at the crunch of bones. When it finished, it turned its head toward him, hot breath gusting in his direction. Jon lifted the torch, illuminating the ridges and folds of ebony scales. He thought of the partial lore he had read, about how Targaryen riders would speak certain high Valyrian words to their dragons. Daenerys was said to have used Dracarys as a command for fire, though that was a rumor from across the sea. Even so, Jon parted his lips, voice echoing in the cavern. Dracarys. He felt foolish. Nothing happened. The dragon regarded him, unblinking. Then it snorted and a wisp of flame flickered in its throat, as if acknowledging the word but not unleashing its full fury. Jon's pulse hammered, a swirl of excitement and trepidation in his gut. He reached out with his free hand, brushing the dragon's snout. Its warmth pressed back, and for a moment, Jon thought he felt the hum of its breathing merge with the thud of his own heart. This is no stable hound, he reminded himself. This is a creature of nightmare and wonder, older than your entire line. Still, some new resolution took hold in him. He thought of Robb, pinned between Lannister might and the uncertainty of alliances with Renly or Stannis. He thought of Sansa, a hostage in King's Landing, and Arya, missing entirely. He pictured the leering face of Joffrey, the lies of Cersei, and the cold brutality of Tywin. A surge of anger rose in him, strong enough to set his teeth on edge. The Black Dragon must be the answer, must be the hammer to crush the lions that had torn his family apart. He stayed there for hours, kneeling near the dragon, sometimes speaking in quiet tones, though no words or spells he uttered felt more potent than the raw emotions within him. Eventually, he left the cavern, the dragon's presence lingering in his mind like a half-remembered dream. The next morning, he set about preparing the castle for a potential journey south, one that might include the monstrous beast beneath its foundations. How does one move a creature large enough to flatten a stable with a single wing beat? The question felt absurd. The only hope was that if he could coax the dragon into the open, it might sense the freedom of the skies and choose to fly. Even thinking such a thing made his chest tighten with both exhilaration and fear. But first, he needed word from Robb as to where and when this mighty new advantage should be unleashed. If they marched too soon, they might lose the dragon to enemy fire before it learned to fight. If they tarried too long, the war could turn in the Lannisters' favor. It was a delicate balance, and as days crawled by, Jon felt tension coil ever tighter in his gut. Each dawn, he half expected a messenger to gallop through Winterfell's gates bearing news that Robb had engaged Tywin in a grand battle, only to be outnumbered and forced to retreat, or worse. While he waited, Jon spent hours training with sword and spear in the courtyard, refusing to let his martial skills dull. The men who accompanied him joined, forging a small but fierce cadre. The older garrison soldiers looked on with a mix of curiosity and respect. Slowly, Jon sensed a shift in how the inhabitants of Winterfell regarded him. The black cloak he once wore was set aside, replaced by stark leathers and furs. Though he was not Ned's legitimate son, the castle folk saw in him a reflection of their late lord's discipline and quiet determination. Whispers abounded that maybe he truly was the rightful heir to Winterfell in the absence of Robb, but that was overshadowed by Robb's coronation as king in the north. Jon thought often of the oath he had broken. His desertion from the Night's Watch still weighed on his conscience, but with every new cruelty the Lannisters inflicted, with every fresh rumor of Joffrey's barbarity, he reminded himself that his vow to protect the realm was no less valid simply because he had left the Wall. The true threats to the realm were not only the wildlings or the others, but also the tyrants who sat on the Iron Throne and spilled innocent blood. On the 13th day after receiving Robb's letter, another raven arrived. Jon practically snatched the message from the trembling maester's apprentice who delivered it. The letter bore the seal of House Tully, indicating it had come through Riverrun or some allied outpost. He unfolded it, reading Robb's words by the dim torchlight of the hall. "Jon, time runs short. Tywin's men have seized the crossroads in and threatened to cut off our supply lines from the north. I push east to the Twins, hoping the Freys will keep their oath. Yet I do not trust them. Rumor grows that Stannis is gathering men at Dragonstone, and Renly is likewise mustering in the Reach. The realm fractures further each day. The Lannisters hold Sansa still, and word is that Arya may have escaped the city, though her whereabouts remain unknown. Cannot linger. If we do not break Tywin now, he may unify his banners and grind us down. Bring the weapon we spoke of if it is ready. Otherwise, join us as soon as you are able. Winter may be coming, but the war is here and now. Robb Stark, King in the North." Jon's hands clenched around the parchment. He felt an echo of the old bond he and Robb once shared, running through the practice yards as children. In that bond, he heard the desperation in Robb's words. The king in the north would not last long in a war of attrition against the Lannisters' wealth and resources, especially if the southern Baratheon claimants did not ally with him. He closed his eyes, inhaled, and made a decision. The black dragon would be taken south. Or, if the gods were good, it would fly. The moment was fraught with uncertainty. If he could not control the creature, it might rampage. If it refused to leave Winterfell, they would have lost precious time. But waiting any longer might doom Robb's cause, and the cause of every northerner who had pledged their lives to avenge Ned and protect their homeland. Jon summoned Herod, Vicon, Torrhen, and Lance to the courtyard. The wind carried a biting cold, and it felt as though the promise of winter was truly at hand. The four men stood at attention, serious and grim. "We march south to join Robb," Jon announced. "We'll take what supplies we can carry. I leave a small guard here to keep Winterfell secure. The main difference from a typical march is we're taking the dragon." Their faces were a tapestry of shock, excitement, and dread. Torrhen spoke first, voice trembling. "How do we take the dragon, my lord? We'll attempt to coax it from the crypts. If it cooperates, we march with it. If it takes wing, we ride behind. If it refuses, then I must remain until I can persuade it." Torrhen exchanged glances with the others. "And if it won't be coerced?" Jon's mouth set in a hard line. "Then I stay, alone if necessary, until it agrees or kills me. But I believe it has accepted me as something more than just another man. We have to try. The fate of the North may depend on it." That night, torches and lanterns lined the courtyard. Soldiers, stable hands, and servants stood along the perimeter, uncertain but drawn by rumors that something monumental was about to happen. Jon descended one last time into the crypts, leading a skittish horse draped in fresh meat. Vicon accompanied him, though Jon instructed him to remain at the entrance for his own safety. When Jon reached the collapsed wall, he heard a low rumble echo out of the darkness. The black dragon lay in near darkness, as if waiting for him. He swallowed, guiding the horse forward. The poor creature's eyes rolled in terror as it caught the dragon's scent. Jon soothed it as best he could, then unfastened the slabs of meat and tossed them closer to the beast. The dragon reached out with a serpentine neck, snapping up the offering in a flurry of teeth. Jon spoke in a low voice, half to the dragon, half to himself. "We go south, you and I. There's war there, and your fire may turn the tide. I will not bind you in chains or force you, but I beg you, come with me." The dragon swallowed its meal, eyes shifting to him. Slowly, it rose to its feet, its movements rippling with savage grace. Jon fought the urge to step back as it stalked closer. When it drew near, it lowered its massive head, letting him place a trembling hand on its snout. Jon felt the power thrumming beneath that black hide. He shut his eyes, focusing on the swirl of emotions in his chest. Duty, loyalty, vengeance, sorrow, hope. He prayed, in whatever silent way Targaryens once prayed, that the dragon would heed him. Then he turned and began walking toward the exit. For a heartbeat, he feared the creature would refuse, that the darkness would remain unbroken behind him. But he heard a scraping shuffle, the scrape of claws on stone. The dragon was following. Lantern light revealed the enormous silhouette, wings half-furled, eyes glimmering in the gloom. Vicon gasped when he saw the beast emerge. Even in the faint light, the dragon appeared impossibly large. Its neck craned to peer at the man, then it snorted a jet of flame. Vicon recoiled with a startled cry, but the dragon's posture was not hostile, merely curious. Jon urged them onward, creeping through the crypt's winding corridors. Torches flickered along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made the dragon appear even more monstrous. At the crypt's entrance, the watchers huddled in uneasy silence. A collective gasp rippled through them as the dragon's massive head appeared in the torchlight. Then the rest of its body followed, emerging from the dark passageway into the open air of Winterfell's courtyard. The night sky above was clear, dotted with cold stars, and the black dragon raised its head, sniffing at the crisp wind as though tasting freedom for the first time in ages. Murmurs and exclamations spread through the assembled crowd. Soldiers gripped their swords, some in awe, some in fear. A few even fell to their knees. The dragon towered over them, each movement exuding raw menace. Yet it made no move to attack. Jon stepped forward, drawing eyes and whispers. He stood so near the creature that a single swipe could end his life. "It's all right," he called out to the onlookers, though his own heart hammered. "Stand aside. Give it space." Men and women scrambled to obey. Then Jon spoke to the dragon again, as calmly as he could. "Come, let's see the sky." He walked across the courtyard, pushing open the main gates. The dragon followed with slow, thumping steps, talons gouging the packed earth. Some in the crowd backed away in terror. Others hurried to gather their things, not wishing to be trampled. Jon led the dragon through the gate, out onto the broad field that surrounded Winterfell. The watchers from the walls craned their necks, torches flickering in the darkness. The moment the dragon cleared the gate, it stretched its wings wide. The span was breathtaking, enough to overshadow a dozen men side by side. Jon felt the gust of air as those wings flapped once, twice, stirring a swirl of dust and leaves. The beast let out a roar that rattled the stones of Winterfell, a triumphant challenge to the night. An excited terror gripped Jon's stomach. Would it take flight and vanish? Would it incinerate them all? Instead, it flapped harder, lifting a few feet off the ground in a billow of swirling air before settling back down. This landing shook the earth beneath Jon's feet. The dragon seemed uncertain, as if it had not stretched its wings in centuries. Jon braced himself, shielding his eyes from the debris. Then he dared to approach again, placing a hand on the creature's flank. The scales were hot to the touch, vibrating with life. "Easy," Jon whispered, though his words likely meant little to the beast. "We'll ride south, you and I." From behind him, Herod's voice trembled. "My lord, I've never seen anything like... is it safe to even ride with it? We've not bridle nor harness." "It may not need one," Jon said, stepping back. A wild idea flickered in his mind. Could he mount the dragon as Aegon the Conqueror once did Balerion? The very thought made his stomach drop. Yet if the dragon accepted him, perhaps that was the only path forward. Tywin Lannister would quake at the sight of a single Targaryen rider. Jon gestured for the men to prepare the horses and gather the supply wagons. The black dragon stood in the field, scanning its surroundings with regal calm. Occasionally, it tested its wings, sending gusts across the grass. That night, the household at Winterfell hardly slept, too entranced by the monstrous presence in their midst. Fires burned high, and watchmen kept a wary eye on the horizon, lest some foe appear to challenge them. In the gray light before dawn, Jon mustered his small force. He intended to leave only a minimal garrison behind, those too old or infirm to travel. At the head of the column, near the open gate, stood the black dragon. Its tail dragged lines in the dirt, cutting grooves that already formed small trenches. Jon swallowed hard, approaching it with slow, deliberate steps. He turned to Herod, Vicon, Torrin, Lance, and the handful of others who would ride with him. "We march for the trident," Jon declared, voice carrying in the hush. "King Robb is in need of us. We bring a power that has not walked these lands in generations." Some men let out hoarse cheers. Others simply watched with pale faces. The notion of traveling with a dragon defied imagination, but they had little choice. If the North was to stand, if Sansa was to be freed, if Ned's murder was to be avenged, they needed to bring every advantage to bear. Jon turned back to the dragon. The beast regarded him with an inscrutable gaze. He inhaled, stepping close enough to feel the heat radiate from its scales. Then, with trembling hands, he grabbed hold of a curved spike along the dragon's flank, bracing himself against the ridges. The dragon shifted, letting out a low rumble. Jon tried not to think about what would happen if it decided to lash out. Ever so carefully, he lifted a foot and placed it on the beast's foreleg, using the scales like steps. He heaved himself upward, hooking his leg over the top of the dragon's shoulder. It made a growling noise, but did not shake him off. His heart thundered in his chest. From this vantage, he could feel the powerful muscles beneath him. It was like sitting astride some enormous, coiled serpent, taut with the potential for sudden violence. He reached forward, searching for a ridge or spike to grip. The dragon turned its head to regard him, one large gold eye narrowing. Jon wondered if he would be roasted alive for this presumption. Yet no fire came. Instead, the dragon extended its wings with a whoosh that staggered the onlookers. Jon fought to stay balanced as the beast rose onto its hind legs, then flapped once, twice, lifting into the air. A startled cry burst from Jon's lips, echoed by gasps from the men below. The ground fell away, replaced by a rush of wind and swirling dust. The dragon lurched upward a few yards, wings beating furiously, then dropped back down, slamming into the earth so hard that Jon nearly lost his grip. He clung to the dragon, heart pounding. The creature shifted its weight, trying again, launching into an awkward flight that lasted only a few seconds before landing. Some watchers might have laughed in relief if the situation hadn't been so terrifying. The black dragon's flight muscles, stiff from centuries of slumber, would need time to strengthen. For now, it seemed capable of short, brutish hops, not graceful aerial maneuvers. Jon exhaled shakily as the dragon settled on all fours. He slid down to the ground, legs trembling. Even that brief moment in the sky had felt like stepping into a whirlwind of chaos. But he sensed that with practice, the dragon would soar again. They simply needed to give it space and time. He turned to the men, who stared at him with a mixture of awe and alarm. "We'll proceed on foot and horseback," Jon said, doing his best to sound confident. "The dragon will follow at its own pace. Let's hope it grows accustomed to flight soon." Thus began a slow, surreal procession southward. At the van rode Jon, flanked by Herod and Vicon, with Torrhen and Lance managing the wagons. Behind them followed the black dragon, lumbering forward on powerful legs. Its wings occasionally flared open, as though testing the air for an opportune moment to take flight. The rest of the northern soldiers remained a careful distance behind or ahead, giving the creature a wide berth. Overhead, clouds drifted across a washed-out sky, and the smell of winter clung to the crisp breeze. Their journey was fraught with challenges. Local villagers fled at the sight of the dragon, hurrying into their hovels or scattering into the woods. Jon could hardly blame them. If he were in their position, he would be terrified too. Some who were braver or more foolhardy crept close enough to gape at the spectacle, while others screamed warnings of a new Targaryen invasion. Jon rode with his hood up, trying to appear more stark than Targaryen, though the subtle truth weighed heavily on him. Despite the slow pace, they made steady progress. Each evening, they found a clearing or abandoned farmstead to camp. Jon ensured that the dragon ate well, hunting wild game or devouring the cattle he purchased or seized as needed. More than once, the dragon took off in a short burst of flight to catch prey that had eluded the men. Yet it always returned, drawn to Jon as though by an invisible tether. Each time it returned, it landed more smoothly. Jon watched the changes in its musculature, the growing confidence in its wing beats. The black beast was remembering how to be a true dragon in the skies. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of travel, they reached the outskirts of the Riverlands. Smoke and ruin marked the territory around them. Fields burned, villages pillaged, remnants of the war that had marched back and forth across these lands. They began to encounter scattered corpses along the roads, soldiers wearing Lannister livery or else men loyal to the Riverlords, all casualties of a bitter conflict. The tension in Jon's party grew. They were nearing the front lines, and the presence of a dragon would not go unnoticed for long. On a cold dawn, as they broke camp near a wooded grove, Torrhen rushed up to Jon with wide eyes. "My lord, our scouts report a band of Lannister outriders approaching. They're 2 miles east and closing in fast." Jon felt his mouth set in a grim line. So it begins, he thought. How many? Perhaps 24 mounted men. Enough to spot our dragon if they crest the next ridge. Jon clenched his jaw. If the outriders saw the dragon, they would race back to Tywin with that priceless intelligence. Robb's advantage of surprise would be lost. At the same time, if they let the outriders draw too close, a skirmish could erupt, alerting the rest of the Lannister forces nearby. He ran a hand through his hair, mind racing. "We need to decide quickly," Herod said, pulling on his gloves. Jon looked to the beast resting under a large oak. Even lying down, it dwarfed the surrounding brush. "We fight," Jon decided. "We can't risk them reporting back." They gathered a few men to form an ambush. Jon led them, leaving the dragon out of direct sight behind a rise in the land. The watchers took up positions behind thick shrubs and fallen logs. Sure enough, within the hour, the rhythmic thud of hoofbeats announced the Lannister outriders. The golden lion sigil on their banners fluttered as they crested a small hill. Jon counted at least 20 knights and men-at-arms, led by an officer with a burnished helm. Hidden among the undergrowth, Jon waited until the outriders were close. Then, with a swift cry, he and his men burst from concealment. Arrows whistled from Vicken's bow, felling one of the knights immediately. Jon charged, longclaw in hand, letting the tension of the past weeks ignite his reflexes. He closed with a lancer who tried to skewer him from horseback. Jon sidestepped, slicing upward to catch the man's arm. Blood sprayed across the saddle. The horse reared, whinnying. Chaos engulfed the clearing. Lannister men shouted, turning in confusion at the sudden attack. Herod and Torrhen flanked the left side, cutting down 2 more as they tried to wheel their mounts. A few Lannister soldiers managed to regroup and charge. Jon ducked a swinging blade, slammed his pommel into another rider's thigh, then yanked him from the saddle and finished him with a swift thrust. His breath hissed in white puffs, the cold air swirling with the stench of steel and blood. One outrider managed to break away, spurring his horse down the road, presumably to carry word of the ambush. Jon cursed, but before he could give chase, a thunderous roar tore through the air. The black dragon appeared over the crest of the hill, half running, half leaping into flight. It soared across the clearing in a single, shocking sweep of wings, the downdraft flattening grass and foliage. Several men, both Lannister and Stark, stumbled back in terror. Before the fleeing outrider could vanish into the woods, the dragon spat a jet of fire that engulfed horse and rider in an instant. Screams pierced the morning. Jon forced himself not to look away, though a sick lurch turned his stomach. This was the raw, brutal power that had once subdued entire kingdoms. The flames subsided, leaving a scorched patch of earth and a twisted, burning silhouette. The remaining Lannister men panicked. One tried to fight, but he was quickly overwhelmed. 2 others flung down their swords and attempted to flee on foot, only for the dragon to land with a bone-shaking impact, cutting off their escape. Its jaws snapped, incinerating the pair in another roar of flame. The acrid smell of charred flesh and seared leather burned Jon's nostrils. He felt horror and a grim sense of destiny mingle in his veins. The skirmish ended as abruptly as it began. None of the Lannisters survived. Jon's men stood in shocked silence, staring at the black dragon as it prowled the edge of the clearing, smoke drifting from its nostrils. Herod let out a shaky exhale. "Gods be good," he whispered. "This is no ordinary war beast." Jon nodded numbly, the rush of battle draining from his limbs. "We must move quickly. The noise and flames will be seen for miles. We continue south to find Robb's host before we're discovered." They gathered horses, stripped whatever useful arms or supplies they could from the dead, and reassembled their column. The dragon, seemingly energized by its first real taste of war, flapped its wings and soared overhead for a short distance before landing again in a thunderous crash. Jon sensed that each passing day strengthened its flight muscles, and with that, the devastation it could unleash. As they pressed deeper into the riverlands, they passed burned villages, rotting corpses ravaged farmland, evidence of constant clashes between the North, the Lannisters, and the local river lords. Reports from refugees indicated that Tywin was encamped near Harrenhal, with detachments roaming widely to cut supply lines and terrorize the local populace. Jon's heart sank at the scale of suffering, all part of this great game for power, for control of the Iron Throne. Did his Targaryen claim even matter if the land bled so profusely? Eventually, they sighted the banners of House Stark near a wide, meandering river. Robb's army was spread along the banks, with tents clustered around a battered keep that had likely been used as a way station or watchpost. A few outriders galloped to confront Jon's approach, but recognized the stark livery of his men. Then they saw the dragon. The outriders' faces went white with shock. They quickly turned back, presumably to warn Robb. Jon's party followed at a steady pace, the black dragon trudging behind, sometimes launching into short flights overhead. By the time they reached the encampment, a throng of Northmen had gathered in alarm. Jon spotted the great Jon Umber, Rickard Karstark, Roose Bolton, and other lords arrayed behind Robb, who was mounted on his direwolf banner horse, Grey Wind snarling at his side. When the black dragon roared and circled overhead, many men instinctively raised shields or cried out. The battered keep's courtyard erupted into chaos. Robb shouted for them to hold rank, though Jon could see the astonishment and a hint of fear in his eyes. Carefully, Jon guided his horse to a halt in front of Robb, then turned to wave the dragon down. After another pass, the creature landed with a crash that shook the ground, dust billowing. Robb stared at the massive beast. Sweat trickled down the side of his face despite the chill air. Then, very slowly, he dismounted and walked toward Jon. Grey Wind snarled uncertainly, hackles raised at the sight of this monstrous reptile. Jon swung down from his saddle and inclined his head. "Your Grace," he said quietly, "I have come as requested." Robb's gaze flicked from Jon to the dragon, then back again. He looked half stunned, half triumphant. "Gods, Jon, you actually did it. A living dragon." Jon nodded. "It wasn't easy, but we're here to fight. This dragon has already proven its fire on a band of Lannister outriders." Behind Robb, the northern lords gawked at the beast, some crossing themselves or murmuring prayers. Rickard Karstark's face was tight with apprehension. The great Jon, eyes wide, let out a booming laugh tinged with awe. Roose Bolton wore a thin, inscrutable smile, though his pale eyes glimmered with calculation. "That's the biggest lizard I've ever seen," the great Jon rumbled. "But if it spits fire at our enemies, I say welcome it." Rickard Karstark muttered, "We lost so much to Targaryens in the past. Now we consort with one." Robb quickly silenced him with a gesture. He approached Jon, voice low. "We can discuss everything else later. For now, I'm grateful. Tywin's men will cower when they see that creature. How soon can you wield it in battle?" Jon glanced at the dragon, which crouched like a coiled spring, tail thrashing idly. "It flies better each day, but it's not at full strength yet. Even so, it's enough to strike fear. If you plan an attack on Tywin soon, we can use the dragon to break his lines or force a retreat." Robb nodded grimly. "Good. We'll finalize details, but first, the men must see that the dragon is ours, not some wild beast that will burn them in their sleep. Can you control it?" Jon hesitated, exhaling. "Control might be too strong a word, but it respects me, enough that it has followed me here." Robb's relief was evident. He placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then let's show our men, and our enemies, what happens when the wolf and the dragon unite. Come, we have much to plan." They led the dragon to a clearing on the fringes of camp, roping off a wide perimeter to keep curious or frightened soldiers at a safe distance. Jon spent most of that day reassuring the northern lords. Many were skeptical, some openly hostile at the notion of allying with Targaryen sorcery. But Robb's victories on the battlefield gave him the authority to overrule them. The great Jon boomed that if a dragon could kill Lannisters, it was welcome in his sight. Roose Bolton listened with cool dispassion, which unnerved Jon more than open hostility. Rickard Karstark eventually grudgingly accepted it, though his eyes never left the dragon for long. Others simply watched from afar, crossing themselves or muttering old superstitions. That night, in a hastily erected war council tent, Robb spread out his maps on a wooden table. The candlelight cast dancing shadows on the faces of the assembled northern lords, the Riverlord allies, and Jon. A hush fell as Robb placed a small carved figure, a wooden dragon, on the table next to their wolf sigil. "Harrenhal stands as Tywin's stronghold," Robb said, tapping a point on the map. Its walls are thick, but it's said to be cursed and partially ruined. If we can force Tywin into open battle outside those walls, our archers and spearmen can hold him, while the dragon's fire wreaks havoc on his lines. Then we sweep in with our cavalry. Once Tywin's defeated, the path to King's Landing lies more open. If we can also gain the support of the Riverlords in greater numbers, or perhaps even sway the Tully forces still biding their time, we might push south to rescue Sansa. Roose Bolton's soft voice cut through the murmurs. And if Tywin simply remains behind Harrenhal's walls, forcing us into a siege? Jon looked at Robb. The king in the north's hand tightened on the table's edge. Then we use the dragon to burn him out. Those walls may be thick, but Dragonfire can reduce stone to rubble. The histories are clear about that. A ripple of excitement passed through the gathering. The prospect of unleashing Dragonfire on Harrenhal was both terrifying and enticing, an echo of the Targaryen conquests that once reshaped Westeros. Jon felt a knot in his stomach. Was this the destiny of House Targaryen? To burn castles and kings alike, leaving only ash? Still, he forced himself to speak. "We must be cautious, Your Grace. The dragon is not an untiring siege engine. I don't know how many bursts of flame it can breathe. We should try to draw Tywin into the field if possible." Ricard Karstark's expression flickered. "Draw him out how?" Robb set his jaw. "We cut his supply lines, harass his outriders, and give him a reason to think we're vulnerable. Perhaps we feign a smaller force, lure him into attacking. Once he commits, we strike, just as we did before. But this time, we have fire on our side." The lords began debating tactics and possible feints. Some argued for patience, others for immediate assault. Through it all, Jon remained silent unless asked. He felt the weight of their expectations, that a single dragon might give them swift victory, that the Targaryen legacy of conquest would spare the North from further pain. Yet war was never so simple. Even with a dragon, men died, cities burned, families grieved. And Jon carried within him the knowledge that this power was as dangerous to friend as to foe if misused. Toward the end of the council, when the final details were being hammered out, Robb pulled Jon aside. He nodded at the map, where Harrenhal loomed like a nightmare fortress. "We move in 3 days," Robb said, voice taut with resolve. "I'll have the outriders spread rumors of our weakness, maybe even claims that I've been wounded. Tywin won't be able to resist a chance to crush us." Jon inhaled, steeling himself. "We'll be ready. I've been trying to teach the dragon short flights. If it can manage a sustained flight by then, it will be devastating." Robb clasped Jon's forearm, searching his eyes. "You've done more than I ever imagined possible, brother. You're no longer just the bastard at Winterfell. You're something else. Our father would be proud." Emotions tangled in Jon's chest. He nodded, unsure what to say, thinking that Ned Stark might be horrified at the notion of unleashing Dragonfire in the name of vengeance. Yet he held on to Robb's words, letting them bolster his courage. When dawn broke 3 days later, the Northmen broke camp. Scouts fanned out across the region, sowing rumors, ambushing small Lannister patrols, and ensuring Tywin's supply convoys were disrupted. The main host moved in a careful arc toward Harrenhal, maintaining illusions of disorganization. Each morning, Robb rode forth with the Great Jon, while Bolton's men took positions along the flanks. Jon remained near the dragon, coaxing it into flight whenever possible, determined to sharpen its aerial prowess. On the second day of marching, they encountered a large Lannister scouting force near a burned village. This time, the presence of the dragon turned what might have been a costly skirmish into a rout. Half the Lannisters panicked at the first roar, scattering into the forest. The other half died beneath spouting flames or the northern steel that followed. Word of the dragon would spread, but that might only stoke Tywin's rage or fear, luring him into the open. Finally, after a week of maneuvering, Robb halted his host in a broad plain southeast of Harrenhal. The massive fortress loomed on the horizon like a ruin of black stone, twisted towers reaching for the sky. Smoke curled from some of its towers, but from this distance, it was impossible to see how many men Tywin had stationed. Scouts returned with conflicting reports. Some claimed Tywin's entire army was within the fortress. Others said a large portion remained camped outside, prepared to face the north if they advanced. Night fell, and the Northmen waited in tense silence. The plan, as Robb had laid it out, was to feign an incomplete encampment at dawn, making it look as though half their forces had yet to arrive. That might embolden Tywin to sally forth. Hidden behind the hills, Bolton's men would encircle from the rear once the Lannisters were committed. And lurking in the sky, for the first time in centuries, would be the Black Dragon, unleashed by Jon's command. Before the break of dawn, Jon rose from a fitful sleep. He checked on the dragon, which lay curled on the grass near a small copse of trees, steam rising from its nostrils. They had fed it well on cattle from the surrounding farmland, both purchased and regrettably seized. Were left little room for delicacy. The men who had never seen the beast up close approached with caution, gazing upon it with awe, as if it were some living deity. Its scales glistened in the pre-dawn light, a deep black that seemed to absorb the shadows. Jon leaned in, pressing a hand to the dragon's flank, feeling the steady cadence of its breathing. "We'll fight together," he whispered, a tremor in his voice. "I only hope we do more good than harm." The dragon's eyes opened, reflecting the faint light. A soft rumble resonated from its throat. Jon stepped back, swung onto his horse, and gave orders to his men. They would remain near the dragon, ready to direct it once the signal came. Above them, the sky slowly bled into pale lavender. The battle for Harrenhal was about to begin. At daybreak, horns sounded from the fortress. The North scouts reported seeing a mass of Lannister troops forming ranks at the gates. Tywin was indeed taking the bait. From the hill where Jon waited, he could make out the glint of armor and the banners of the Golden Lion. The morning sun shimmered on thousands of spears. Tension crackled in the northern camp. Archers took their positions, swords were checked, horses stamped nervously. Robb stood at the center, gray wind at his side, solemn and resolute. Then the fortress gates opened fully, and the Lannister army flowed out, forming battle lines on the plain. Jon felt his pulse quicken. He maneuvered the dragon behind the crest of a hill, out of immediate sight. The plan was to let the Lannisters believe they faced only foot soldiers and cavalry, with minimal archers. Once Tywin was fully committed, the archers would emerge from hidden positions, and Jon would unleash Dragonfire from above. Roose Bolton would close in from the flanks. The trap was set. All that remained was for the pawns to move. Drums rolled across the plain. Lannister infantry marched forward. Jon could pick out their bright red cloaks, the lion sigils dancing in the breeze. War horns bellowed. The North responded with a trumpet of their own. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a unified roar, the armies surged at each other. The clang of steel, the screams of men, and the thunder of hooves erupted, echoing across the plain like a nightmare symphony. Robb led the vanguard, plunging into the Lannister lines with a wedge of northern knights. Gray wind leapt among the ranks, sowing terror. The Lannisters pressed back fiercely, their discipline evident, but the Northerners fought with a burning desire for revenge. Swords flashed, arrows whistled. Shields broke under the impact of warhammers and axes. The ground became slick with blood, the air filled with dust and the metallic tang of battle. Hidden behind the hill, Jon heard the cacophony and knew the decisive moment was coming. He glanced at the dragon, which paced restlessly, wings twitching. "Ready?" he murmured, heart pounding. He lifted his arm in a signal to archers stationed nearby. They began loosing volley after volley into the mass of Lannisters. Shouts of alarm rose from the enemy lines as arrows rained down. Tywin's men tried to form shield walls, but the chaos of the clash made it difficult. "Now," Jon hissed. He turned to the Black Dragon. The beast seemed to sense the shift. With a single, powerful thrust of its legs, it launched into the air. The wings beat furiously, stirring a mighty gust that flattened the nearby grass. Jon mounted his horse, spurring it to keep pace beneath the dragon's flight path. Soldiers nearby ducked and cried out as the creature soared overhead. Jon's adrenaline spiked. This was the moment. From the vantage of the open plain, the Lannisters saw a shadow glide over the battlefield. A shape from legend, black wings spread wide. Panic rippled through their ranks. Men shouted in terror, some pointing with spears at the sky. Others, braver or more foolhardy, tried to loose arrows at the beast. The black dragon roared, a sound that shattered any semblance of confidence. Flames erupted from its jaws, washing over a cluster of Lannister soldiers. Their screams were lost in the roar of infernal fire. Armor melted, flesh burned. In that instant, the battle's momentum lurched in favor of the North. Men who might have held their ground against cavalry or archers broke ranks in the face of Dragonfire. Jon urged his horse around the flank, shouting commands to archers to press their advantage. Bolton's men surged in from the sides, hacking into the disordered Lannisters. The great Jon bellowed a war cry and led a charge that cut deep into the enemy's center. High above, the dragon dove again, releasing another torrent of flame that scorched the field in a swath. Smoke billowed, choking the air. Jon saw a line of Lannister archers take aim at the dragon, firing a volley skyward. Arrows pelted its scales, some lodging in the leathery wings. The beast roared in pain or rage, turning to unleash a punishing blast of fire that incinerated the bowman. Jon's throat tightened. The dragon was not invulnerable, but its hide seemed to repel most arrow strikes. Somewhere in the swirling chaos, Jon spotted Tywin Lannister's banner, a golden lion on a crimson field, near the rear guard. The Lannister patriarch stood with his knights, trying to rally men and maintain discipline. But the unstoppable fury of the dragon broke morale wherever it flew. Robb, seeing the opening, drove his cavalry deeper. Clusters of Lannister men began to flee, the stench of their own burning dead unhinging them. Jon galloped through the fray, parrying a spear thrust from a panicked soldier. He slashed at another who tried to stand his ground. The black dragon passed overhead, scorching a catapult that Tywin's men had begun to set up. The wooden siege engine exploded in flames. Smoke boiled, turning the rising sun into a hazy red disk in the sky. Bit by bit, the Lannisters began to crumble. Jon could see it in their eyes, in the way they threw down weapons or turned their horses to run. Tywin's personal guard fought stubbornly, but they were isolated. Bolton's men enveloped them on one flank, the Greyjohn's warriors on the other. Robb led the final push, gray wind snarling and snapping at the heels of the Lannister knights. Sensing defeat, Tywin signaled a retreat, but the black dragon dove once more, cutting off the primary escape route with a river of fire. Screams echoed across the plain as men were trapped between burning fields and the spears of the north. Tywin himself managed to pull back, flanked by a handful of mounted knights who galloped east, presumably aiming for another gate or a crossing of the God's Eye. Robb urged his cavalry after them, determined to capture or kill the man who had orchestrated Ned Stark's downfall. Jon reined in his horse near a patch of scorched ground, thick with smoke and moans of the wounded. The black dragon landed with a thunderous crash, battered by a few arrows that protruded from its neck and wings. Steam rose from its nostrils, and it snarled in agitation. Jon dismounted, approaching carefully, ignoring the chaos around him. "Easy, easy," he murmured, stepping over charred corpses to reach the beast's flank. With trembling hands, he grasped an arrow embedded near a scale. The dragon hissed, but allowed him to snap the shaft. Blood, dark and thick, oozed around the wound. He could hear the clamor of the northern host sealing victory, cavalry rounding up prisoners, foot soldiers stamping out dying pockets of resistance. The swirl of violence had subsided into the ugliness of post-battle cleanup, the final throes of a field soaked in blood. Jon's own breath rasped in his lungs, his face smudged with soot. He reached up and placed a hand against the dragon's neck, feeling its powerful heartbeat. It had fought for him, with him, just as he had dreamed, and it had won them the day. But the cost weighed heavy in his chest. The stench of burned men, the screams of wounded and dying, the knowledge that war always demanded a toll in lives. Perhaps there was no more merciful method to end this conflict quickly than the terror of Dragonfire. Or perhaps this was just the beginning of a new cycle of fear and destruction. He did not know. All he knew was that Robb had asked for a decisive blow, and the dragon had delivered. A rattle of hoofbeats approached. Jon turned, seeing Robb ride up. His sword arm was streaked with blood, gray wind padding behind with blood-matted fur. Robb's face was flushed with exertion and triumph, though his eyes held a note of grim understanding. He surveyed the battlefield, taking in the columns of smoke and smoldering remains. "It's done," Robb said softly. "Tywin's army is shattered. He fled with a fraction of his force. Harrenhal is ours if we choose to take it or burn it." Jon nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. His gaze flicked to the black dragon. "We have the means to burn it, if you wish." Robb's jaw tensed. He looked back at the fortress's looming silhouette. "I want to corner Tywin, ensure he can't regroup. Then we negotiate or force Sansa's release. We've proven we have the advantage now." A wave of relief mingled with fatigue washed over Jon. Yes, with the dragon, no lord in the Seven Kingdoms will lightly defy us. Robb dismounted, his eyes flicking to the wounded beast. "Is it badly hurt?" "Arrow wounds. I think it will heal," Jon said, exhaling. "It's strong." Robb placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "Then we tend to it, and then we press our advantage." He paused, eyes glimmering with gratitude. "You've done what no one else could, Jon, or Aegon if you prefer. Today, the North sees you not as a deserter or a bastard, but as the harbinger of victory." Jon felt a hollow pang, thinking of the men who had perished in flames, but he hid it behind a curt nod. "Let's make sure the victory counts for something. Let's free our sister, bring justice to the Lannisters, and perhaps bring peace to these lands." A faint smile crossed Robb's lips. "We will." Together, they surveyed the ruined battlefield, the scattering of cinders drifting in the morning light. In the distance, Harrenhal's black towers stood, grim witnesses to an age of dragons resurrected. The war was far from over, but this day had proven one truth beyond doubt. The dragons had returned to Westeros, and with them, so too had the power to reshape the realm in fire and blood, or perhaps, if Jon had his way, to forge a new path, one that honored both the wolf and the dragon in a realm weary of endless war.